Hi, Founder fans. Jason here with Michael Troy of the American Revolution to continue our discussion on the generals of the American Revolution, generally speaking, if you would. And today we are moving on to two gentlemen who were appointed much later in the war than most of the major generals we usually discuss or have discussed so far, William Smallwood and Samuel Holden Parsons. Michael, thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here as always.
All right, so we're going to start with William Smallwood, who, as I was just saying before we started, I always confuse with other people on accident. So let's talk a little bit about Smallwood. Michael, where should we start?
Well, he's from Maryland, and he's in fact the only major general from Maryland in the entire war. So if you're from Maryland, you may want to know the hometown hero. He was actually born in 1732, same year as George Washington, and he was born right across the river from George Washington, from Mount Vernon. His plantation is right on the Maryland side of the Potomac River.
Fascinating. And
Yeah.
what was he up to leading into the revolution?
Well, he came from a very wealthy family, large plantation. Um, his father, grandfather, and great grandfather all held a seat in the Maryland Assembly, and he took over that seat when his father retired in, I think, 1761 or two, something like that. Uh, so he was in addition to be a plantation owner, he was a member of the colonial legislature. Um, He supposedly participated in the French and Indian War, although I've never really been able to find out any details about exactly what he did during that war. But um, yeah, I don't know.
He may have
Um,
been given the title as many wealthy people were at the time and not actually done it, as they say.
yeah, I mean, he may have just been a militia officer or something and hung out in Maryland the whole time. Who knows? He did actually, before, when he was growing up, he went to England for several years and actually went to Eton, which is a relatively prestigious school in London or near London. Um, and based on his age, I think he may have been a classmate of Barry St. Ledger. They were at least within a year or so of each other.
That's an
So
interesting connection.
yeah, I mean, a lot of the top generals from Britain went to Eton. So if he was of the right age, he would have met quite a few of them. I think the Howe brothers went there, and um, quite a few others. So, but he and Ledger were around the same age, so he very may well have been friends with Barry St. Ledger. Um, but as I said, he came back to America. He got a position in the legislature. His father died, um, I think, late 1760s, and he was the firstborn son, and so he inherited the bulk of the estates. Um, but he was also an opponent of British policies. He was a good patriot early on. He was elected to the provincial assembly after the colonial assembly fell apart. He supported a bunch of the early protests, the non-importation agreements, all the things they were doing with regard to the tea taxes and the Townshend Acts and all those sorts of things. He was a Maryland leader in the protest movement before the war.
And then eventually, not right away, I was always surprised to learn, about a year into the war itself, he is appointed a colonel and sent to fight.
Yeah, well, it's actually pretty early on. He doesn't join the Continental Army right away, but in very late 1775, Maryland decides to form its own army. This is not just militia; they want to have regulars who are paid for and supported by the state of Maryland. And Smallwood is chosen to be the leader of that, what becomes known as the Maryland Brigade of about 1,400 men. And he's made a colonel. And yeah, most of the southern colonies really don't send a whole lot of people up to the siege of Boston. They're still kind of waiting to see what happens. There's only a few um, companies of riflemen and a few other things that really come from the south. So he's training and building up this regiment in Maryland. And one of the interesting things about the Maryland Regiment is that just about everybody who joins it, including the privates and everything, are all gentlemen, landowners, men of substance. And so it becomes one of the best financed armies in the colonies. They all have real uniforms. Most of them have muskets with bayonets. They have a fife and drum corps. So they don't look like a bunch of scraggly militiamen. They look like real soldiers when they go off to war.
Interesting, and he's essentially commander in chief of this tiny army.
Yes.
Very interesting. And so when he leads his men, it's actually, is it those men or does he lead militia to north when he moves to New York?
He takes a portion of the brigade with him. Not all of them go, but he takes about 400 or 500 men, and they head up to New York when Washington is moving the Continental Army down from Boston to New York. And his Marylanders get stationed in Brooklyn just as the British are about to land. And they are very prominent in the Battle of Brooklyn. Um, when For those folks who don't know the story necessarily, the British land they come from Staten Island to Long Island, and they're trying to breach the American lines, which are set up on the Gowanus Heights, which is a small line of hills on Long Island. The British find a pass that's unguarded by the Americans on the far left of the American flank, and so they send some soldiers to uh, fire on the Americans and keep them occupied while the main force sneaks around behind them and attacks them from behind. So the Americans are really caught off guard and nearly surrounded before they know what's happening to them. And they have to escape. And Smallwood's Marylanders are the ones who hold off the entire British army long enough for the rest of the American army to escape. The Marylanders and the Delaware Blues are the two that really stand up and hold up the entire British and Hessian army so that the rest of the Americans can escape. Now, I should mention Smallwood is not there that day.
Fair enough.
Unfortunately, many of the top officers who were commanders in Brooklyn were in Manhattan on the days leading up to the battle and the day of the battle himself, because George Washington had forced them all to come over and sit on a court martial in Manhattan. And so many of the officers missed this first big battle of the war.
Right. And the Marylanders and the Delawares you mentioned also, they're the ones who are usually referenced as the Immortal 400. Or
Yes, Washington's Immortals
right. Okay.
are sometimes the reference that they get
Right. And who?
because they are really such an impressive group at this fight. And Washington is known to say, I forget his exact words, but what a pity it is to see the great men who are dying today as he's kind of watching this in his spyglass from Manhattan.
Right. And who was it that took charge in his absence? Was it Mordecai Gist? Is that the or Gist? Is that how you say the name? Can't recall. I
Um,
should know who took over in his absence that day. Uh,
I don't know for sure, but Gist
what?
was uh, junior to um, Smallwood, so it very likely could have been him.
Yeah, I know he was there, but I can't remember if he was the top guy. But either way, yeah, it's a really harrowing tale because they suffer pretty great numbers, as Washington's quote, as you paraphrased. It's a very famous quote. I also don't remember exactly how it goes. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
so that's it,
but
and
they
that's
take
a
really heavy casualties at that battle. Yeah.
yeah. But they essentially saved the army in a really important time because everyone can evacuate, and then later they have to sneak away under cover of fog, of course. But fair enough. So Smallwood, as you said, was in Manhattan, but he's not captured or killed. Where does he go from there?
He's he still retains a good portion of his regiment. They do manage to escape, and they pull up. Um, uh, Washington finally decides to get out of Dodge before the British completely cut him off, and so they move up north. And Smallwood gets his personal first real combat with his men at the Battle of White Plains. So he does a pretty significant battle there. Um,
And I understand Smallwood sticks with essentially with Washington's army for the most part for the first half of the war. He's generally with him. I don't recall if he's at Princeton and Trenton, but I do believe he stays with him through New York, and he'll end up going on the Philadelphia campaign as well for most
well,
of those important battles.
the Marylanders do stick with Washington and participate in those campaigns. Smallwood does not.
Okay.
He is actually wounded at White Plains and goes back to Maryland to recuperate. So he's out of the war for almost a year during that really crucial year.
All right, so that's why he missed Trenton and Princeton.
Yeah.
Right. So interesting. He again, full disclosure. Smallwood is not. I'm not an expert on Smallwood. That's for sure. That's why you're here to help. So he's wounded. He goes to Maryland. Do we know anything about the wound?
I don't. I know he received two wounds at White Plains. I don't know exactly what they are, where they were, or whatever, but he does go back to his home to
Yeah, I
recuperate.
was going to ask you that because I did understand he was wounded twice there, so it's at the same time. So he's wounded and then
Yeah, he
wounded
took
and
two
rehealed.
hits.
Okay, okay, so he's healed up and he goes back. He does rejoin the army.
Yeah, he while he's in Maryland recuperating, he tries to recruit a second army to take north, and this army is mostly Maryland militia, and they come up shortly after General Howe lands in Maryland. General Howe comes down and goes through the Chesapeake Bay and lands at Head of Elk, Maryland, on his way to march north and take Philadelphia. So the Marylanders kind of follow up behind Howe and are trying to join up with Washington's army. And they actually get orders to join up with General Anthony Wayne, who is also kind of behind General Howe's army. This is after the Battle of Brandywine. Um, and General Howe is getting ready to cross the Schuylkill River and enter Philadelphia. And the goal is that Washington will um, contest that crossing of the river. And while Washington is crossing it, Anthony Wayne is going to come up behind General Howe's British army and hit them from behind. The British get wind of this and figure out where Anthony Wayne is, and they, of course, attack him in a night attack known as the Paoli Massacre. Uh, General Smallwood, with 2,000 Maryland militia, is only a few miles away from where Anthony Wayne is at the time he is attacked at the Paoli Massacre. And they hear the attack, and his green Maryland militia panics and runs away. And about half of them skedaddle back to Maryland and don't come back. So Smallwood is a little bit mortified by this, but he manages to finally at least join up with some of his army and with Washington, and he's actually given a command at the Battle of Germantown, where he is leading his militia as well as some New Jersey militia to attack the far right flank of the British line. And everything I read says he acquitted himself well or fought with distinction at Germantown. He really didn't fight almost at all, as far as I can tell. His troops had to march farther than everybody else because they were basically coming from the British left line and he was supposed to attack the far right line. So finally, about the time that he gets into position where he's able to contest with the British troops, the rest of the Continental Army is retreating. So he has to kind of turn around and retreat along with the rest of them at that point.
Well, he gave it his best. He followed orders, which at Germantown is pretty good.
He didn't get lost. He didn't shoot his fellow soldiers, which puts him head and shoulders above
Right.
most of the other officers at that
It
battle.
gives you a combination. Well
Yeah.
played. So follows up Germantown. I understand he continues to Brandywine afterward.
Um, no, he wasn't at Brandywine. I don't think, and that was before Germantown.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I'm out of order today. What am I talking?
yeah, he was.
Oh no, my note says he was stationed for a while before Brandywine to guard some mills. So I
Okay.
apologize. I apologize. That's right.
He.
That's how I got Brandywine in my head.
Okay. He. Washington, after Germantown and a few months, kind of settles into Valley Forge. But Smallwood does not join Washington at Valley Forge. Smallwood um, takes his troop and is down near Wilmington, Delaware, which is right on the Delaware River, and they're basically harassing the British who are trying to move up and down the river to get in and out of Philadelphia out to the ocean. So it's a pretty interesting position to be in. He's involved in quite a few raids, and Commodore Barry runs a really impressive raid around this time, and he ends up having to uh, get his men away from the British, and he you know gets his safety by catching up with Smallwood's militia around Wilmington. At one point, the militia, Smallwood's men, actually capture a British ship. Um, a British supply ship called the Symmetry runs aground on the Delaware River, and the men actually come out and capture it. And they capture about, I think it was about 600 or 700 muskets. There's a lot of stuff on it that the Army really needed. The problem was Smallwood decided that when you capture a ship, that's a prize and you get to keep it, right? And sell it. Isn't that the way it works? Um, Washington was like, no, that's kind of a Navy thing. When the Army does it, you just kind of give it to us. And they apparently had this big fight about it. Washington really didn't get into it. He Smallwood told him, well, it's a prize and I'm keeping it. And Washington just kind of turned it over to the Continental Congress and said, you guys need to decide what to do about this.
Yeah.
And Congress basically said, no, you're in the Army, you're not in the Navy. If you capture stuff, we get it. You don't get to keep it.
Yeah. It
And
was
by the way, you have to, when they also captured this ship, it had like the about 40 wives of British officers on it who were trying to meet up with their husbands. So they were forced to feed and take care of these prisoners, which they hadn't planned on doing. So not only did they not keep all the prizes, but it actually cost them money to capture the ship and deal with all the prisoners
right.
that they
Well,
had to do.
that's tough. Well, I guess you can exchange them for anyone.
Well, the women actually did get
Yeah.
escorted back to Philadelphia. That was kind of the gentlemanly thing to do in that time. You didn't hold
Right.
on to.
I am under the impression there was only a handful of times that women were being held, and at one point, I can't remember whose spouse it was. I think it was Elizabeth Lewis, or uh, Lewis Morgan Lewis's dad, Francis Lewis. I believe it was his wife. Was captured in Washington. Like threatened, hey, like we have some of your guys' wives too. Like treat her better. At one point. But I wanted to bring up because you had mentioned this about the ship. There were several incidences like this concerning prizes and ships. It's one of the reasons they established the Court of Appeals in cases of capture, which was just three Continental congressmen were put on this court at a time, but it was really one of the first federal courts or federal bodies at all as we think of federal today under the Constitution, but 10 years before the Constitution to resolve incidents like these where, oh no, who actually gets the prize? So they actually, I know it's a strange tie-in, but it's incidents like that brought about the first federal system in the United States.
Yeah, and it was a very common practice to have prize courts sitting for naval vessels and things like that. I mean, so he wasn't completely out of left field when he was asking for these things. Then when the Navy captured a ship, I think Congress got a third or two-thirds maybe, and then the other share went to the um, captain and crew of the ship that captured the prize ship. So yeah, but they had to have courts that would um, determine who legitimately was the winner of the prize, and then had auctions to sell off the prize and collect the money from it.
Right, exactly. And one of the reasons they made a federal one in the Continental Congress is, if it's in the waters between Virginia and Maryland or New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which court gets to decide that case? Which
Yeah,
I know it's a side note, but I thought it was very interesting. So back to Smallwood over here.
yeah.
He's down there throughout the winter of 77, 78 through Valley Forge winter. Uh, how does he come out of that? What happens after that?
Well, the dispute over the ship, the prize ship, kind of created a rift between him and Washington, so they weren't really talking to each other for a while. I really can't find what he did in 1779. I don't know if he was with Washington's main army or not. Um, the next time I really hear about him is in 1780 when he is moving south with Horatio Gates to Horatio Gates gets sent south after the entire Continental Southern Army is captured at Charleston, and Gates is sent down with a relief army that includes Smallwood and his men to retake the South.
So he is with Gates at the disaster of Camden, because I agree. The my research, the notes I have here, he's reappears at Camden, basically.
Yeah, yeah. General Cornwallis fights General Gates at Camden. The battle is a complete mess. Everybody runs away. General Gates runs away. Um, Smallwood, however, with his men, is one of the few regiments that actually stands and fights the British for a time. So he acquits himself quite well, and as far as anybody can be the hero of a loss, he comes out of that battle quite well. And it's actually shortly after the Battle of Camden that he gets promoted to Major General.
And when he's promoted to Major General, does he get any particular assignment, or do things carry on pretty much the same way?
No, ironically, after his promotion, it's kind of the end of his career. He does a little bit of fighting, leading some North Carolina militia where they're trying to use the remains of General Gates's army and locals to kind of do what they can to stop the British. Of course, General Nathaniel Greene is sent down with a third Southern Army to deal with the loss of Gates's army. And it's shortly after General Greene arrives in the South, for reasons I don't fully understand. Smallwood just kind of leaves and goes home again and sits out the rest of the war in Maryland doing not much else.
Well, I guess when you're a rich fancy pants, you can do that kind of thing from time to time. But it works out for him because although he does not seem to participate too much more in the war itself, he does take the lead in Maryland, so to speak. Uh, Unless I'm overlooking something, I know immediately after the war, I believe he participates pretty heavily in the creating the Society of the Cincinnati. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, he comes out of the war a hero and a leader of Maryland and all that sort of stuff. He's involved. He's the head of the Maryland chapter of Cincinnati, and he's elected governor of the state of Maryland. And he serves 3 1-year terms, including the year that Maryland ratifies the U.S. Constitution.
right, which he essentially oversees that transition.
Yeah,
Well, no, because he's out in 1788, so not the actual transition to the new government,
he's
but
not around when the actual federal government
right,
takes control, but he gets Maryland to ratify the Constitution, which was a big deal. Maryland actually really did not like the Constitution very much. There was a lot of opposition in that state,
yeah,
and he convinced them to ratify it anyway.
yeah. I mean, Maryland was very slow on signing the Articles of Confederation, so you can only imagine
Yeah,
how upset they were at the Constitution. But they ended up ratifying it fairly quickly compared to some other states. Uh,
yeah, yeah.
and then after that, essentially retirement. By this point, he's a little bit of an older gentleman, I believe, and he only lives a few more years.
Yeah, he after he finishes his term as governor, he lives for about 3 or 4 years on his plantation and then dies in 1792. He's not that old. I think he's 59 years old,
Right.
maybe 60. We don't know exactly what year he was born, but so yeah, 59, 60 years old. Um, as somebody in his late 50s thinks, that's not that old.
Right, exactly. Not anymore. And that essentially wraps up William Smallwood, whose life is fairly mysterious in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because he doesn't have a real career in the federal era because he obviously passes away, and because he misses a lot of the real key moments during the war because he's either wounded or home for other reasons. He just doesn't necessarily stand out that much as one of the big important generals of the war.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, he did his duty, and when he did fight, he seemed to fight fairly well. He was, did acquitted himself very well in a few of the battles where he did fight.
Yeah, well,
So
that's what's interesting is he like even when other people were not having success, he still had success.
yeah, I think he had a reputation as kind of a prickly guy who didn't get along with others. He was very annoyed by the appointment of the foreign generals, the French generals, and he did not like von Steuben at all for some reason. So,
The only one.
and it may have been because von Steuben got promoted right past him to be major general.
Right, because
Might
we
have been
just
one.
spoke about von Steuben last week, so he
Yeah,
just got it. And then he um, I keep wanting to say Parsons. I'm so excited to talk about Parsons. Smallwood was a point. It was a while later, wasn't it? It was like almost 2 years later that he didn't get his promotion. Right, because it was
yeah,
79.
78 to 80. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it was a little over 2 years. Um,
that's a long time to wait.
yeah, they weren't appointing a whole lot of major generals at that point, and
Sorry,
I mean the
Willie.
couple.
We got our guy. Sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, he was kind of on the. He was a brigadier for like 4 or 5 years, which is a fairly long time in the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so that was the life of William Smallwood.
All right, and now we get to move on to Samuel Holden Parsons. Samuel Holden Parsons to me is a very particularly fascinating guy, even though he's very low on the list of major generals. It took him quite a while. uh, Parsons, I'll jump in right away. Parsons comes from a wealthy family in Connecticut, and
Mm-hmm.
though there's a whole bunch we could say about him, unless I'm skipping something you'd like to say, I know he early on joins the Committee of Correspondence, and what's really fascinating about Parsons is he writes a letter in 1772, March of 72, to Sam Adams in Massachusetts. And he actually says, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially is referencing the Stamp Act Congress and is saying, "Hey, we have we've had congresses before. Why don't we have an annual congress of this nature?" Which essentially is like 2.5 years before the first Continental Congress, predicting that Congress.
Yeah, he did really push the Continental Congress. I just will say a little bit more on his background.
Sure.
Although he was born in Connecticut, he um, grew up much of his life in Massachusetts. I think his family moved to Massachusetts when he was about 9 years old, and he went to Harvard, which is interesting mostly for the fact that a couple of his classmates included John Hancock and John Adams. And John Adams and he particularly became pretty good friends, and they wrote to each other for most of the rest of their lives on a whole range of things. But so yeah, he was kind of buddies with some of the really top people from the war. And yeah, he came from a really good family. He served in the legislature. All that stuff. His uncle was a really important leader who later became governor of Connecticut. Um, and One of the things I found kind of interesting about him was that he did not fight in the French and Indian War. He graduated from Harvard same time as John Adams, right as the French and Indian War was beginning, and he went to go study law in Connecticut, which, Adams did the same thing. He went and studied law in Massachusetts. Neither of them went off to war and were marching through the trenches to do battle with the French.
You don't hear people bring that up very much about John Adams. That he did
Yeah,
not fight in the French and Indian War, though he was old enough to.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
he
he
was
was in his
close.
mid-20s. He was
Yeah,
in his mid-20s. It would have been the perfect age to be a soldier had he had the inclination.
yeah, it's escaping me, but I know there's a quote somewhere in the John Adams pantheon where in one of his diaries, I think it is, where he essentially says, "I, I wish I could be a soldier, but I'm like not built for it," or something of that nature. Like he legitimately wanted to be a soldier, but didn't, as usual, didn't think himself qualified for the position,
Yeah,
which is a very John Adamsy thing to say. But yeah, so Parsons then moves over to, like you said, he studies law in Connecticut and stays there for what I believe is most of the remainder of his life. Uh,
yeah.
and then, like I said, he writes this letter, which is fascinating. I'm not going to read it. I have it here, but I'm not going to read it. But he says, like, to Sam Adams, like, we need to meet once a year. And even in 1772, he's saying, kind of floating the idea of independence. Like, I'm not totally attached to any prince, I believe is the quote, which is fascinating. It really sets his state of mind leading into the revolution. Like I said, 1772 is several years before things really get heated.
Yeah, nobody was publicly talking about independence that time, but there were a few New Englanders who kind of saw the writing on the wall and said, "Yeah, that's where we're headed."
Yeah, well, if you're writing a Sam Adams, you could be a little bit more
Right.
comfortable.
In private letters like that, that was fine.
Right. So and after which the war breaks out. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. He's in the Continental
Yeah,
Congress, the Committee of Correspondence,
yeah,
and
and despite not serving in the French and Indian War, he does serve in the militia of the Connecticut militia in the interim years between the French and Indian War and the Revolution, and yeah, gets promoted up to the rank of colonel after a period of time. So he's a colonel by the time the American Revolution breaks out. And one of the interesting things you have to remember about Connecticut is that even in the colonial era, they had an elected governor. So they never really had a point where the government, they had to break away from the colonial government and form their own. The colonial government kind of supported the patriot cause the entire time. So he was, part of this legislature and this militia the whole time they were leading up to the war. Um, as soon as he hears about Lexington, he rushes up there to see what's going on and kind of get some intelligence for to bring back to the Connecticut legislature. And on his way back from Cambridge, he comes across Captain Benedict Arnold, who is on his way up to Cambridge. And the two of them stop and have an interesting conversation for a while. And Arnold tells Parsons that what they're really going to need at Boston is artillery. And by the way, I've been to Fort Ticonderoga several times because Arnold did a lot of mercantile business between Connecticut and Quebec. And so he would pass by Ticonderoga and he's like, by the way, there's dozens of cannons there and, only a few dozen soldiers not guarding them particularly well. Might be a good idea to go after it. Um, Parsons really doesn't say much at the time, but takes Arnold's thoughts under advisement. And when he gets back to Hartford, he teams up with another legislature, a guy by the name of Silas Deane, and they agree to fund a campaign to take Ticonderoga. And they get a bunch of um, soldiers to participate in it, but they want to use people that are up closer to the fort to do the actual work. And so they end up getting Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys to attack the fort. So they're the ones who actually sponsored the attack on Fort Ticonderoga.
which is why when Benedict Arnold shows up later without an army, he's like, well, "No, I thought I was in charge here." That
Yeah, well,
plus his
Benedict,
Massachusetts commission.
right. The Green Mountain Boys, who are from New Hampshire, well, I guess they're technically living in New York, but they won't admit it. Um,
New Hampshire would disagree with you there.
yeah, um, they consider themselves basically New Hampshire men. but they
Yeah,
are operating under the authority of Connecticut. And interestingly, Connecticut claimed the Vermont area as well as being part of Connecticut. So it's kind of interesting for them who did not believe in Connecticut's claims at all to be fighting on behalf of Connecticut to take Fort Ticonderoga.
it's called the Connecticut River. Let's see what the problem is here.
But yeah, at the same time, they're operating under the authority of Connecticut to take Fort Ticonderoga. Benedict Arnold was making the case to the Massachusetts provincial government to do the same thing, and he gets a commission to go to that. And what he was doing was he was going to go raise an army of Western Massachusetts militia. But by the time he's out there recruiting, he hears that Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys are about to attack, so he kind of abandons his attempts to raise an army and just goes and joins theirs and basically says, "I'm in command." Ethan Allen says, "No, you're not, but if you want to come with us, sure, why not?" And the rest is history.
Yeah, I know. He sits down there. Ah, Parsons stole my idea. I thought I could trust that guy. It's like Benedict
Yeah.
Arnold's the one who doesn't trust someone. Uh, so as for Parsons, now I don't want to skip anything because he does a ton of stuff pretty early on in the war. He does end up going to, um, he does bring his militia to Massachusetts after Lexington and Concord.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, Connecticut forms a whole army that they're going to send up to be part of the siege of Boston. It's under the command of Major General David Wooster, and Parsons is a colonel of one of the regiments in that larger army of, I think it was about 3,000 men.
Man, he's one of the primary, maybe not primary, one of this many people who fund the Connecticut service uh, because of his deep pockets. Uh, I
Yeah,
know, I know the government definitely funded it. As you said, like the government stayed the same. Jonathan Trumbull, the governor, was one of the few people who actually stuck around. So I know it was largely funded by the government itself, but uh, I understand Parsons working with, as you said, Silas Deane and Leffingworth and uh, I think Wentworth. There's like names are escaping me, but a whole handful of the wealthy men of Connecticut all threw in a bunch, and Parsons was one of those gentlemen.
yeah, he was one of the big political leaders who was advocating the establishment of this army, and he was putting his money where his mouth was. And that's probably why he got as important a position within the army as he did, because he really had no military experience.
Right. So he heads up there. I'm not sure exactly when he arrives, but I don't know if he's there early enough for like the Battle of Chelsea Creek and that kind of thing. But he does participate in Bunker Hill.
Yeah, right. It's kind of a confusing mess as to exactly who's doing what up there, and a lot of the minor skirmishes. He is present at Bunker Hill and apparently is an eyewitness to the whole thing, but he's actually not, as far as I can tell, he wasn't on the line at Breed's Hill. He wasn't actually fighting. He was kind of, there was like a few hundred men on Breed's Hill that really did all the fighting, and then there were like a few thousand men like on Bunker Hill that were just sitting there watching them. I
Right.
think he was one of those people that was watching.
Right. Which makes sense. You can't get your whole army on the one hill. But just for context, he is there for that. Um,
Yeah, he writes some really compelling descriptions of the battle and what happened. So he was a good eyewitness anyway.
he's great. He's a very good eavesdropper. And then Parsons sticks with the army and relocates to New York City when Washington and his men make that journey. And
Yeah,
then
you have to remember most of the Connecticut Army evaporates at the end of 1775. Their enlistments end and they go home. So he kind of Parsons sticks around and is trying to recruit more and kind of gets command of a reconfigured regiment at that point. And right, he follows Washington down to New York and is part of the whole thing. And because of his loyalty and perseverance and all this, that's about the time he gets his promotion to brigadier general.
right, and it's also about this time that, out of left field, he's contacted by David Bushnell. I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but he is connected to the turtle. David Bushnell is the crazy inventor who first invents an underwater explosive device, and then, because he needs something to put it places, invents the submarine. And then, when he's recruiting men to find someone to pilot the submarine and launch the first attack, uh, they kind of do almost a little bit what von Steuben would do later, where he gets 3 or 4 men who they think would be good for this, kind of like astronauts. He brings them in, he trains these really high quality men, and then the one that stands out gets to pilot the ship. And the one that actually, Bushnell contacts Parsons to help locate people in the area, and of these people that Parsons helps choose is Parsons' brother-in-law, Ezra. What's the name? Lee. Yes,
Lee.
Ezra Lee.
Yeah.
And it's Parsons' brother-in-law that is chosen and pilots the first submarine in world history, largely due to Samuel's influence, which I know is a
Yeah,
random story to bring up, but really important.
that's an interesting one. Bushnell's brother was actually supposed to be the pilot of the submarine, but he got sick a few weeks beforehand, and that's when they had to do this kind of last minute search for a new pilot.
That's right,
And
because Bushnell's brother, I think, was in one of Parsons under Parsons' command in some fashion.
yeah, I think that's right.
That's how they got
Which is
connected.
what Parsons knew about it. The submarine really was a top secret project. Only a few people knew about it, like Governor Trumbull and a couple others who really needed to know. And Parsons was one because he needed to deploy some men as part of the mission.
Right. Right. Okay. Fascinating. So back to the main story. I always like to tie in the submarine wherever I get the chance, which is not the last time we'll reference the TV show Turn during this Samuel Parsons discussion. It will come back up. He was very much left out of that show on several occasions.
Yeah, he was very active in that theater, though. Um, yeah, he was at the Battle of Brooklyn.
Mhm.
He was actually one of the regiments that retreated while the Maryland Immortals were defending them. He was one of the men who took advantage of that and escaped.
Well, they wouldn't have been
Um,
immortals if they didn't have anyone to defend. So
right.
thank you, Samuel Parsons.
Um, and then, yeah, he also fought at White Plains
Mhm.
along with Smallwood. So, yeah, he did see some combat there, and he did not participate. He did not go south with Washington through New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He was not part of the Princeton campaign. During all of that, he was left in command of some units up around Peekskill, New York, which was kind of the Hudson Valley area, just in case they wanted to keep the British from, in case they wanted to try to move upriver or something like that. So he kind of had a side command at this point.
Right, where several people seem to kind of get lost in the Highlands in New York over the course of the war. It seems like a really important place. Can't let anyone go up the Hudson, but also nothing much happens. But that's not really the case for Parsons.
Yeah, he's serving under General Israel Putnam at this point too. You got to think they're both Connecticut officers, and Washington liked keeping Connecticut officers near Connecticut. It was just
Right,
more motivating for them and helped with recruiting and all that sort of thing.
right. And it did help. And again, unless I'm skipping anything here, let me know. But time goes on, and then he is involved with much of the engagements on Long Island.
Right. His command is covering most of Connecticut, and at this time, the British occupy Long Island, the Americans occupy Connecticut. Their two are separated by a strip of water, and very frequently the British conduct raids into Connecticut, which the Americans have to defend against, and the Americans conduct raids onto Long Island, which the British have to defend against. So he was part of that whole gamesmanship of back and forth. He, for your Turn fans, he was the one who issued the orders to go attack Setauket. Um, and he also was the one who organized the Meigs raid into the far eastern tip of Long Island. So, yeah, he was involved in commanding all that stuff, although he didn't actually personally participate in them.
Yeah, Return John Meeks. First name Return. Absolutely love that gentleman. I love that name. I believe we shouldn't go too far of tangent, but I understand there's a story that like he got the name Return because his father proposed to his mother and then she said no, so he got on his horse and started riding away and she said no, return. And no one
Return,
knows if
John.
yeah, Return John Meeks, Return, that's right. So they named the kid Return John Meeks. Who knows if it's true? It's certainly adorable.
Well, it's a weird story, and they gave that weird name to like three more generations of Return Jonathan Meigs.
Well, that's
Like
right,
they
because
were
his
still,
kids end up being important, like justices and legislators in the West, I
yeah,
believe, for the most part.
yeah. His grandson is also a Civil War general.
Right. Return.
So,
But anyway, as for uh,
but
Parsons,
we digress.
yeah, and I should bring up that one of the reasons Connecticut was so involved in Long Island is there's actually a long-standing history. I grew up down there, so I'm a little attached to it. There's a long-standing history between Connecticut and Long Island. In fact, even when New York was under Dutch control, most of Long Island was part of Connecticut, and so they most of Long Island had been settled in the first place by people from Connecticut who essentially came from Massachusetts before that. So there is that long-standing attachment, and also because the water, the sound really you could row a boat across as they do in the TV show Turn. Uh, Many of the patriots who evacuate Long Island go to Connecticut. Many people from Long Island went to Yale to study your Benjamin Talmadges and such. So there's a real connection between those two locations, which why it makes a lot of sense that you'd have a Connecticut officer overseeing all the engagements out there.
Yeah, if you're ever out in the like eastern part of Long Island, you're way closer to Connecticut than you are to New York City at that point. It really is kind of more in the Connecticut sphere of things.
Yeah, you go to the North Shore, you can see Connecticut.
Yeah.
It's right there. Anyway, uh, so he spends a good portion of his time there. For about 2 years approximately, and then I believe he's given command of West Point for a time.
Yes, West Point really isn't West Point at this point. It's still being built, and he's overseeing much of the construction and engineering, the development of West Point. But
Right.
yeah,
Again, West Point is only about 30 miles from the Connecticut border, also, so it's not like he's that far away. For those of you who don't
right.
know,
He's kind of in charge of this whole area from Connecticut through the
yeah,
Hudson Valley. This whole command.
right, and
And
at
he,
this point he's a brigadier, so it makes sense that he would have this kind of territory,
yes,
despite William Heath being there and not really doing much. Sorry, William. Forgive me. Uh, Now he is. Does he takes over? Does he take over for Putnam at one point when Putnam has his stroke? Does he officially take over for Putnam, or does he kind of quietly?
yeah. Putnam has a stroke, a debilitating stroke, in at the end of 1779. He, as far as I can tell, doesn't actually resign his command, but he's in no shape to do anything. And so it appears that Parsons is really doing the job of Major General Putnam at that point because Putnam is basically in bed, unable to do much of anything.
Which again speaks to Parsons overseeing this va- fairly vast swath of territory, despite his rank not necessarily meriting it. But someone needs to take charge.
Right, and he's doing a reasonably good job. But then they decide to put a more senior Connecticut general in command of West Point, a guy named Benedict Arnold, who for some reason requests that command. I'm not never quite sure why he did that, but
Who knows? But Parson remains there.
Parson remains in the area. He's not actually at West Point, but he's still in command of the overall region. It's not really clear exactly what his command is at that point. One of the things he is doing, though, is dealing with a lot of intelligence work for the Continental Army, trying to collect intelligence on what the British are up to. He's not directly tied to the Culper Ring, as far as I know, but he is kind of working in that same area and trying to do a lot of the same things. And at one point, he actually his people intercept a letter from Benedict Arnold to John Andre, discussing some of their nefarious plans. Um, but the letter is in code, and they don't know who the sender is and who the real recipient is, so they can't really identify what's about to happen as Arnold is attempting to deliver West Point to the British Army.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for he could have been a hero, but just a regular. Major General in the Continental Army, because I don't want to skip ahead. I have a tendency to skip ahead when I'm excited about things, but it is not too long after that. It's the following winter he is finally promoted to Major General.
Right. He's a brigadier at the time that Arnold is makes his escape. And he, as a brigadier, sits on the court martial of British Major John Andre, who, of course, is sentenced to death. After Arnold leaves um, the Continental Army, there is no Connecticut Major General because Spencer has resigned, Putnam has had his stroke, and now Arnold's gone. So I think one of the main reasons he gets his appointment at the end of 1780 is because there's no longer a Connecticut Major General, and Connecticut is one of the most important states in this fight.
And he's been doing the work for, at this point, about 2 years, almost 3 years. So, position, please.
Yeah, no, he's a very capable officer, more than deserves it. But right, they're promoting very, very few people at this time in the war, and so yeah, the fact that he gets one at all is impressive.
Right. Well, as we said before, it's in the after what's his name? Not von Steuben.
Smallwood.
Uh, well, before Smallwood, after the round we discussed last week, is it von Steuben? Yeah, they wait like 2.5 years before anyone gets it, and then Smallwood and Parsons get it a little bit, pretty close together.
Yeah, they're
Compared.
about a month and a half apart.
Right. Okay. Thank
Um,
you.
but even von Steuben and Conway both got positions in 77 and early 78. But I think before that, yeah, I guess there were a few in the fall of 77. They appointed quite a few. But
Right.
yeah, so yeah, it was more than 2 years until they did Smallwood and Parsons. And then there's another more than a year before they appoint another one
Well,
after them.
Parsons is the last one before Yorktown.
Yes.
So speaking of Yorktown, Parsons does
And
not.
right, he's appointed a year before Yorktown. But
Right.
yeah.
Almost. Yeah, pretty much a year before Yorktown, but the last one before the major hostilities are concluded. But he does not participate in Yorktown.
No,
He
once
is
again, he is left in the New York area to keep an eye on Sir Henry Clinton and the main army at New York, while George Washington takes the bulk of the Continental Army down to Virginia. So Parsons is kind of sitting on the sidelines in New York watching it all happen.
right. Well, but they're also, well, I'll say, charged with not distracting the British, but keeping the British aware of their presence so that they don't just necessarily abandon New York for Yorktown.
Right. Yeah, you want to keep them amused, is the term that was often used.
Well played.
But yeah, they basically, want to be constantly occupying their attention so that they're not doing anything else.
Right. And then Yorktown does happen, and the war ends. Now, Parsons' story does not end here quite yet.
Well, Parsons doesn't actually make it to the end of the war. He resigns his commission in the summer of 1982, or 1782. Sorry. Um, yeah,
He was committed.
he is he had been suffering a lot of health problems throughout the war, and it's really getting to be too much for him. And like many officers, he's become completely bankrupt, and so he really wants to go back now that the war is effectively over. And he's not getting any good assignments anyway. He wants to go back to practicing law, and so he resigns his commission more than a year before the war actually ends.
Well, it
Um,
technically ends, but the hostilities had primarily concluded. And to be fair to this gentleman, he had been at war constantly for 7 years. So it's
yeah,
not
he
like
was
he
one.
just bailed.
No, he certainly did his time, and there was no, he wasn't considered really a shirker for leaving when he did or anything.
No.
He was very popular in Connecticut. He got reelected to the legislature. Um, he was part of the Society of Cincinnati. He certainly was happy with everything he did. Um, very involved in Connecticut politics. He supported Connecticut's ratification of the Constitution. So yeah, he was very involved in things after the war.
Right. But then he turns his focus west.
Yeah, Congress appoints him to do some negotiations with Indian tribes on the frontier. And Parsons does that, and he also becomes a director of a private company known as the Ohio Land Company, which is going to be involved in the selection and distribution of Western frontier lands to Revolutionary War veterans. All these guys were promised land for their enlistments during the war, and now Congress really has to pay off on those promises,
Right.
and they need a company that's going to be doing the management of the land distribution.
And it's important to note that when it comes to Western land claims, especially in the Ohio region, we like to think Virginia primarily, but also Pennsylvania and several other states laid claims. Ohio, with the exception, I'm sorry, Connecticut, with the exception of where New York lies on modern maps next to it, Ohio thought it had all the land the size. I keep saying Ohio. Connecticut thought it had this a strip of land the size of modern Connecticut that went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Uh,
Connecticut claims everything. As I said before, they were claiming part of New Hampshire. They claimed northern Pennsylvania and southern New York and Ohio, and just anywhere there was land, they were like, yeah, that's ours.
right. Now, to be fair, the original not contract, the original colony
Charter.
is compact. Yeah, uh, it did say to the Pacific, but they didn't necessarily realize how far that might be. Um, that being said, first of all, you see a lot of people from Connecticut settling in Ohio and establishing areas out there. And second of all, it's important to have at least one or two people from Connecticut on this company that's distributing the land because some of that land had been sold by Connecticut to Connecticut people, whether or not they should be allowed to sell that land. Um, and so he ends up going out there.
Yeah, as I said, a lot of this land was being distributed to Revolutionary War veterans. Congress really did this in a horrible way. I know it's hard to understand Congress acting corruptly and inefficiently, but um, they didn't just give land to Private Smith who served 3 years. Here's your 100 acres. They made it so that you had to go out and accept a joint plot of like 5,000 acres with 50 of your friends, and so for an individual who wanted to go claim land, it was virtually impossible to do. There had to be a lot of organization to this. So a lot of men ended up just selling their claims to land to real estate speculators who ended up then breaking it up and reselling it. And I'm not sure to the extent the Ohio Land Company was part of this, but yeah, Parsons was involved in this whole process of trying to get the lands distributed. Um,
And it's that land speculation scheme that led to the bankruptcy of many, many founders
yeah, yeah.
throughout the
Um,
colonies, not just in Ohio, but everywhere.
but Parsons thought Western lands was where money was going to be made, and he desperately needed money, having given up plantation owners like Washington could walk away from their plantations for 7 or 8 years and have a manager run it and come back to a well-established plantation. If you're a lawyer and you're not billing clients, you're not making an income. So he was, living on whatever paper money Congress was giving him or promising him as an officer in the war, but he really was, getting no money at all. So he needed to rebuild a fortune, and he thought he could do that in the West. He really wanted to become governor of the Northwest Territories. He was pushing to be appointed to that. Unfortunately, he didn't get that. It went to Arthur Sinclair. But he was a lawyer, and so Congress thought he would be good to be the Chief Justice of the Northwest Territories. So he got that job,
Yeah.
and his two sons got some jobs within the court system there as well. So they were doing reasonably well for themselves.
Well, reasonably well, considering they lived on the frontier, where they moved to Marietta, which was the
Yeah,
only town for miles, maybe not hundreds, but yeah, it's not close to Pittsburgh, that's for sure. And
Yeah, it really was out in the middle of nowhere other than Indian Territory. And Marietta itself was like 50 houses or something. It wasn't much of a thing.
I mean, I guess it was a town, but it was very
By
isolated.
Ohio standards at the time, it was a town, but yeah,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
as close as you got.
Yeah, by coastal standards, it was, I guess, a village. Um, so he does go out there, and I don't want to skip ahead of anything, but he's not out there very long before he goes on a bit of a, well, the word surveying expedition.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things he did was survey land to try to determine, what could be distributed and who it should be distributed to and all that. So he actually goes off on a surveying mission in late 1789, like November, which is not a good time to be out and about in the wilderness. And he just vanishes, doesn't show up, and nobody really knows what's happened to him. They, of course, fear the worst. And the following spring, their fears are realized when they find his frozen corpse out in the middle of the wilderness. So, yeah, he
Somewhere
had
in,
an accident and froze to death, and that was the end of General Parsons.
yeah, I understand some of the speculation is he probably drowned and then his body froze, although there is no real way to know. But from the what I've read at the time, uh, the it doesn't seem like there was any foul play or any broken bones or any bullet wounds. It's just the conclusion they seem to have drawn at the time was he drowned.
He probably he probably drowned, or he very easily just could have gotten soaked and died of hypothermia and then froze over after that. We don't know, but yeah, it looks like the elements got to him in some way. And
Right. When with me the exception maybe of Decoudre has the honor of the least noble death of a major general in the Continental Army.
well, we'll get to Henry
Unfortunately.
Knox next week, but okay.
Oh, fair enough. Oh, that's right. Oh man, that's right. I forgot. We're getting to Henry Knox next week, so I hope you guys are looking forward to that. I did forget how that ends. Stay tuned. I just know no Governor Morris, but it's all right. Um, and unless there's anything you want to add, that's the story of Samuel Holden Parsons. Just a fascinating guy who's has a really sad ending there, but really
Yeah,
interesting.
he really is kind of remembered as part of Ohio's history and one of the real founders of Ohio. So even though he only spends maybe a year or two out there,
Yeah.
that kind of is a big part of his legacy. But yeah, unfortunately, he passed away, very quickly as a result of this accident. So he really played no role in the federal era beyond the year or two he was in Ohio.
Right, because he died. Yeah, he goes out just as the Constitution's coming around. He dies in early 1789, or is it late? Well, okay, no, it's sometime between late 1789 and early 1790. So it's really the beginning of George Washington's administration.
Yeah, Washington is president by the time he dies, but yeah,
But
that's about
Thomas
it.
Jefferson only just showed up. Like they only just started appointing justices. So it's really the beginning of the United States as we know it.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, thank you for coming back. This one was a little shorter. We just did these two gentlemen, and their lives are a little bit quicker to sum up. But next week, especially with Henry Knox in there, might be a little bit longer. But next week we get to the generals who were appointed major general after Yorktown.
Yep, and he's going to be our last three.
Yeah. Oh, well, we'll be sad about it next week. Michael, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.